Hi, kids. Welcome to another episode of Bible Stories with Your Mom. We ended on the bottom of page 92 last time, and we are now beginning to talk about Saul and David. This will finish up chapter 8 for us. So, Saul and David. The Lord told Samuel to go to Bethlehem and anoint one of Jesse's sons as Israel's eventual king. The Lord said, "Don't look at someone with an impressive physical appearance. Look for someone with a heart for me." When Samuel informed Jesse the Lord had been chosen, but nope. When Samuel informed Jesse the Lord had chosen one of his sons as king, Jesse had 7 sons appear before the prophet, but Samuel was not led to anoint any of them. Jesse's youngest son, David, was out watching the sheep. Jesse sent for him, and when he came home, the Lord said to Samuel, "This is the one, anoint him." On that day, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. After Samuel anointed David, the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, who was then tormented by an evil spirit. For relief, Saul looked for someone to play calming music. He recruited David, an outstanding young man and an excellent musician. David would play his harp to calm Saul when he was emotionally upset. Saul was so impressed with David that he made David his armor bearer. The Israelite and Philistine armies were holding positions on opposite sides of a valley. One Philistine, Goliath, was over 9 feet tall and wore armor that weighed over 100 pounds. Pay attention, kids. This story is also very common and memorable, and maybe you might be able to learn something from it. Pay attention. This would be the story of David and Goliath. Okay, so Goliath, huge, 9 feet tall, giant, wore armor that weighed over 100 pounds. The shaft of his spear weighed 15 pounds. Each day he would taunt the Israelites, "I defy you. Send your champion to fight me." But no one had the courage to fight Goliath. The taunting went on day and night for 40 days. Have you noticed how everything's always 40 days? Jesse sent David with supplies for his 3 oldest brothers who were serving with Saul's army. When David arrived on the battlefield, he heard Goliath taunt Saul's soldiers and watched them cringe in fear. They said that the man who killed Goliath would be rewarded with marriage to one of Saul's daughters and be exempt from taxes. After David talked with many soldiers, Saul overheard that someone was asking about Goliath and sent for David. David told Saul, "I'll go fight him." The idea was ridiculous in Saul's opinion, but when David told how he had killed a lion and a bear while protecting his father's sheep, Saul agreed and gave David his armor. The armor was so large and bulky that David left it behind and instead picked up 5 stones from a stream and his shepherd's staff. When Goliath saw that David was only a boy, he sneered at him and cursed him. David wasn't intimidated. He ran toward the giant and shouted, "I have come against you in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of heaven and Israel." David hurled 1 stone with his sling, hitting Goliath in the forehead and stunning him. He fell face down. David raced forward and killed Goliath with the giant's own sword and then cut off his head. When they saw that their champion had been killed, the Philistine army fled with the Israelites in hot pursuit. The dead and wounded littered the road for miles. David's victory led to a lifelong friendship between David and Saul's son, Jonathan. When the 2 men met, they instantly bonded, but not everyone was thrilled about the stunning defeat of Goliath. When the army returned home, the women gathered from all over Israel to honor the victorious soldiers. They danced and sang, "Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s." Saul became insanely jealous because David was receiving twice the honor for the victory. He made David commander of 1,000 men, but David was so successful in battle that Saul became even more fearful of his popularity. Instead of giving David his daughter as he had promised, Saul said David had to win more battles against the Philistines, and then he could marry Saul's oldest daughter. Saul hoped David would be killed while fighting. David didn't marry Saul's oldest daughter, but instead he married his other daughter, Michal, who actually loved David. Maybe it's Michelle, Michal. Looks like Michael. Maybe it's Michelle. I don't know. So they married for love. Good for them. Saul was obsessed with getting rid of David and saw this as another opportunity for David to be killed. Saul told David he could marry Michelle, I don't know, if he killed 100 more Philistines. But instead of losing his own life, David and his men killed 200 Philistines, and Saul gave Michal to David as his wife. David continued to prove himself as a capable leader in battle after battle with the Philistines, yet his victories only made Saul more convinced David was a threat to his kingship. Saul's deceitfulness and murderous intentions forced David to become a fugitive from the man he had sworn to serve. Saul tried to get his servants and Jonathan to kill David, but Jonathan and David were close friends. Jonathan warned David instead. Jonathan tried to reason with his father. Though Saul vowed he would not kill David, he immediately broke his promise and hurled a spear at him. This was enough. David was convinced that his life was in danger. We're going to call her Michelle from now on, just because Michael sounds weird. Michelle deceived her father and helped David escape to Ramah. When Saul sent soldiers, the Spirit of the Lord prevented them from capturing David. When Saul himself went, the Spirit took control of him, and Saul stripped off all his clothes and lay naked all night and prophesied. People wondered if Saul had become a prophet rather than the king. David and Jonathan met secretly, and David asked whether there was any hope of reconciliation with Saul. They set up a secret sign to inform David so his life would not be at risk, and made an enduring pact of friendship. At the monthly festival, Jonathan asked his father if David could return home to Bethlehem. Saul flew into a rage, cursed Jonathan, and even hurled a spear at him. Jonathan knew it was useless to reason with his father. He shot a series of arrows to signal David of his father's insane determination to kill him. The two friends met for one last time, and then David became a fugitive. David hoped to find safety with, here's another name I'm going to mess up. Oh, even if I say it slow, I don't know that it's going to be good. Ahimelech. If you say it really fast, maybe nobody will know. Ahimelech, the high priest in the town of Nob. But Ahimelech was afraid of Saul and suspicious of David. When David asked for a weapon, the only one Ahimelech had was the sword of Goliath. David took it and left because Doeg, Saul's chief herdsman, was there and spotted David and his men. David made a risky decision. He fled to Gath, the Philistine city and the former home of Goliath, but he had a problem. Because the Philistines recognized him as the one who had killed Goliath, fearing for his life, David acted insane, scratching on doors and drooling down his beard. The king of Gath was insulted that his men would let a crazy madman into his city and then expect him to show hospitality. David then went south to the cave of Adullam, where his brothers, relatives, and other fugitives joined him. David now had about 400 men with him. They went further south to Moabi, and David asked the Moabite king if his father and mother could stay while David hid out in his stronghold in the desert. The prophet Gad advised David to return to Judah, but when Saul found out about that plan, he was certain David was conspiring to become king. When Doeg told Saul that Ahimelech had provided David's men with food and the sword of Goliath, Saul summoned Ahimelech and ordered his men to kill the high priest. They refused, so Doeg killed him and 85 other priests. They killed all the priests in Nob and their entire families. Only Abiathar, Ahimelech's son, escaped, and he joined David, who promised to protect him. Though he was a fugitive from Saul, David gained popular support by defending Israelite towns when the Philistines raided them. Saul was relentless in his pursuit of David and almost captured him on several occasions, but each time the Lord helped David escape. When Saul found out David was at Keilah, the Lord warned David, and he and his men fled into the wilderness. Saul's men searched day after day, but the desolate, dry, vast Judean desert provided protection for David. Jonathan, however, was able to find David, and he renewed his pledge of friendship and support for his close friend. He assured David that his father would never capture him and that David would someday become the king of Israel. Jonathan returned home and never saw David again. We have like 2.5 more pages, so hang with me. Though David knew he was destined to become king, he refused to kill Saul because the Lord had anointed him. When Saul and 3,000 elite troops went to En-gedi, a rocky, rugged area west of the Dead Sea, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself, not knowing David and his men were hiding deeper in that cave. David cut off a piece of Saul's robe without his knowing it. David's men wanted to kill Saul, but David wouldn't let them. The Lord forbid that I should attack the king, the Lord's anointed one. After Saul left the cave, David waited until he was at a safe distance and then called, "Why do you listen to the people who say I want to kill you? Look, I have a piece of your robe in my hand. I could have killed you today if I wanted. The Lord will judge between you and me." Saul had to admit that David was a better man and that he deserved to be king. Knowing David would become king, Saul asked him to spare his family and not kill all of his descendants when he took the throne. After Samuel's death, David moved further south into the desert wilderness. When he and his men needed supplies, he sent them to Nabal, whose name means fool, and he was a wealthy sheep rancher. Nabal was crude and mean-spirited. Maybe it's Nabal. That's probably what it is, Nabal. He mocked David's men and called them a band of outlaws. When David heard what Nabal had said, David took 400 armed men to kill Nabal the fool. Nabal's servants told his wife that David was coming. Abigail acted quickly, putting together enough food for a feast and going with her servants to take it to David. When she met him, Abigail showed respect and convinced him it would be wrong to murder her husband. David was impressed and said, "Return home in peace. I promise I will not kill your husband." When Abigail arrived home, Nabal was partying and drunk. The next morning, when Abigail told Nabal about meeting David, he suffered a paralyzing stroke and died 10 days later. When David heard Nabal was dead, he asked Abigail to marry him. She agreed and became David's wife. David also married, here we go, Ahinoam. Ahinoam. Saul had given his wife, Michelle, to a man named Palti. I'm confused. David had a second chance to kill Saul when he found out Saul again was searching for him with 3,000 elite troops. He and Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night and penetrated the inner circle of guards. As before, Abishai wanted to kill Saul, but David wouldn't let him. David took Saul's spear and a jug of water near Saul's head and then sneaked out of the camp. From a nearby hill, David taunted Saul's general Abner. "If you are such a mighty warrior, why haven't you protected your king?" David showed him the spear and the jug. By this time, David's voice had awakened Saul. David told him again that he would have killed him, but refused. Saul acknowledged that he himself was a sinful man and that David was honorable and heroic. This was the last time Saul and David met. David knew Saul would not stop hunting for him, though, so he made the risky choice to hide out among the Philistines. When Saul heard David was with the Philistines, he stopped searching. The Philistine king, Achish, that's what I'm going to say, King Achish, allowed David to live in the city of Ziklag. During the year and a half David was there, he raided Canaanite towns, but lied to Achish, telling him that he had raided towns in Judah. Achish believed David and thought how his own people must hate him. Achish was so convinced David was his ally that when the Philistines prepared for another war with Israel, Achish made David his personal bodyguard. Witchcraft was strictly forbidden in Israel, but when Saul saw the size of the Philistine army, he was terrified. Because Samuel had died, Saul couldn't consult with him, so he asked his advisors to find a medium. So she wouldn't recognize him, Saul disguised himself and asked the witch of Endor to call up the spirit of a man who had died. She refused at first and accused him of trying to get her killed, since Saul had forbidden mediums from contacting the dead. But she asked who he wanted her to call from the dead. When he said Samuel, she screamed, "You have deceived me. You are Saul." Saul reassured her that she would not be harmed, and Samuel did appear, but he told Saul what he already knew. The Lord had abandoned him and would not help him in battle. Samuel predicted Saul and his sons would be killed and the army of Israel defeated. Saul fell down, paralyzed with fear and weak from hunger because he had not eaten for a full day. Saul's men finally convinced him to eat so he could regain his strength. The witch prepared a meal, and after eating, Saul and his men left under the cover of darkness. When the Philistine army assembled for battle, David and his men were with Achish in the rear of the formation. But when the officers found out Israelites were in their ranks, they were outraged. They didn't trust David because they remembered how he killed Goliath. Though Achish assured them that he had complete confidence in David's loyalty, they were adamant that David not go into battle with them. Achish advised David and his men to leave secretly. When David and his men returned to Ziklag, they discovered that the Amalekites had destroyed the city and taken all the women and children captive. David sought the counsel of the priest Abiathar, who assured David that the Lord would help him recover all the captives and everything stolen. David pressed so hard in pursuit of the Amalekites that 200 men became exhausted and had to be left behind. The pursuers found an Egyptian slave who had been abandoned by the Amalekites because he was sick. He guided them to the raiders. David and his men caught the Amalekites by surprise and totally wiped out the raiding party. They recovered everything, including the women and children. Some of David's men did not want to divide the plunder with the 200 men who had been unable to pursue, but David insisted everyone receive a share of the spoils. He also sent gifts to the towns that had provided support for David and his men. We're almost done. Saul's rule as Israel's first king came to an end when the Israelites suffered a devastating defeat. 3 of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, were killed, and Saul was mortally wounded by an archer. He ordered his armor bearer to kill him so the Philistines could not capture and torture him, but the armor bearer refused. Saul then killed himself with his own sword. The next day, the Philistines found Saul's body and cut off his head. They placed his armor in the temple of one of their gods and nailed Saul's body to the wall in Beth Shan. When the men of Jabesh Gilead heard how the Philistines had desecrated Saul and his sons, they recovered their bodies and buried them under a tree. Saul had ruled as Israel's king for 40 years. Now Israel was in the same situation it was at the end of the era of the judges. God's people didn't have a king. So next time we meet, we will talk about chapter 9, and maybe they'll find a king in chapter 9. I don't know. We'll see. So stay tuned, my children, as you venture through the whole Bible story with your mom. I love you. Good night.